Um, Once again, thank you, Shelley, for inviting me to speak. Like I said last year, our friendship goes back to more than 40 years, so that's a little scary. Anyway, it's nice teaching you this morning on a beautiful sunny day, knowing that maybe tomorrow will not be the same. So, the topic for today is a comparison between the story of Esther and the story of Yosef. It's a famous one, an interesting one, and I look forward to delving into it together with everybody. So I'm going to share my screen. And please feel free, we're a small group. Please feel free, to write something in the chat or even to open your microphone. Okay, it's nice when people open their microphones and ask questions. So that would be wonderful if you want to do that. Alrighty, so we're going to start our story at the end of the Megillah. And it's interesting because usually when we read the Megillah, we all know the beginning of the story very, very well. We know the middle of the story. And when we get to the very end of the Megillah, we're often not listening because A, we're tired. It's already chapter 10, chapter 11. We've heard a lot of Hamans. We want to get home. And also because the storyline is no longer that exciting. Haman and his sons, they're no longer alive. And then we have some technical information. We're going to start today with that technical information because I think that technical information is really something very fascinating and it will open up our eyes to a whole issue that perhaps we're not familiar with. Alrighty, so what are we told at the very end of the Megillah? We're in chapter 9. Vayichtov Mordechai et hadvarim ha'ele, vayishlach sarim el kol haYehudim asher b'chol medinot hamelech Achashverosh. So Mordechai writes down all that's happened, and he sends it to all the Jews. Pasuk Chav Aleph, L'kayem aleihem lihiyot osim et yom 14 l'chodesh Adar v'et yom 15 b'chol shana v'shana. Okay, so he's sending out letters. He's sending out correspondence to Jews living throughout the Persian Empire. Let's keep this holiday this year and next year. And if we skip down, everyone can read themselves, but if we skip down to Pasuk Chav Gimel, the second paragraph, V'kibel haYehudim et asher hechelu la'asot, v'et asher katav Mordechai alehem, and the Jews accepted what Mordechai wrote. Kimu v'kiblu haYehudim alehem ve'al zar'am, and they accepted it for themselves and for generations to come. And let's skip down. V'imei hapurim ha'ela lo ya'avru mitoch haYehudim v'sichram lo yasuf mizar'am. So we have two paragraphs. We have many, many verses. We have 8 verses which are describing Mordechai sending out correspondence, encouraging the Jews to do it, to keep it going, and to keep it for future generations. So we see here that Mordechai is working very, very hard in establishing the holiday. It's something that we take for granted. We take for granted that there's a Purim every year. But what actually happened, once it transpired, it took effort on the part of Mordechai to get the people to accept the idea that this is going to be a holiday, in the first paragraph that we are going to celebrate, and the second paragraph that our children and all generations to come are going to celebrate. Then we move on to the next paragraph in chapter 9, which is even more interesting. Vatichtov Esther Hamalka bat Avichail or Mordechai Yehudi et kol tokef. Okay, they write down with all its importance, L'kayem et igeret hapurim hazot shenit. Okay, to keep this happening of Purim, the word shenit, a second time, we're not sure what that means. Vayishlach sarim el kol hayudim, and they send correspondence to all the Jews in all the different areas. And in Pasuk Lamed Bet, let's skip to the end. Umamar Esther kiyam divrei hapurim ha'elu v'nichtav b'sefer. Okay, and the words of Esther were accepted and they were written down. What's happening here regarding Esther? Why do we need this third paragraph in chapter 9, which moves from the describing Mordechai's activities to the activities of Esther? What is the difference between the beginning of the chapter and here near the end of the chapter? And it's something very, very interesting. We're going to see that Esther's request is different than Mordechai. Mordechai's request was what? Establishing the holiday of Purim for generations to come. What is Esther's request? So we're reading now from the Malbim. The Malbim is a modern commentator from the 1800s who had a very good, very, very sensitive feeling for the text. And what does he say? The Amda al machloket ben hachachamim. Okay, Esther wanted to have the Megillah that was written down be part of what? Lahosif, look in the second line, al Kitvei HaKodesh. She wanted the Megillah to be part of the 24 books of the Tanakh. We are now in the end of we are in the Persian period. The Tanakh, the Canon, the Jewish Canon is closing. Which books are going to be in? Which books are going to be out of the Jewish Bible? Which are going to be, in a sense, booted off the island? And she is advocating, Esther, my book and Mordechai's book, the story of Megillat Esther, should be part of the 24 books. Ukemoshe katuv chazal b'Megillah, and just like it says, Shalcha Esther lechachamim, it says in the Gemara, kiv'uni ledorot. Esther said, let my book be written and established for generations. The chachamim lo ratzu b'tchila, and the rabbis did not want to accept the book of Esther into the Jewish canon. Okay, so we have here at the end of chapter 9 something really fascinating. We have a window into a machloket, an argument that's going on between Esther and Mordechai and the rabbis of the generation who are making the decision which books are in and which books are out. Now, what was their argument according to the Malbim why it should not be part of the Jewish canon? We know that we're not allowed to add to the mitzvot of the Torah. And their claim was if we add the book of Esther and the holiday of Purim, we're adding something which is not from the Torah. And what does she claim? She claims, okay, we can see here in the paragraph, she says it doesn't have to be on the level of coming from the Torah. This can be something added, we're adding on the level of Chazal. We're adding a mitzvah from Chazal and not necessarily from the Torah. That is what she's going to claim. And what are we told? The Malbim goes here and tells us, and incidentally, if anybody, there's no source sheet. If anybody wants a copy of this PowerPoint, you could just email me. Elise, if you don't mind putting in the chat box my email, and I'm happy to send you a copy of this PowerPoint. Alrighty. So what does the Malbim go on to say? The Malbim goes on to say that we have this machlok, we have this interchange between Esther and the Chachamim. What strength of character Esther has, right? She's saying, no, it's not Baal Tosif because I'm not saying this is from the Torah, but this is something that a neder that we've taken upon ourselves, and we want to add it just like, and she shows the precedence. What's the precedence here? Go down to the end of chapter of the third paragraph. Tzom Revi'i, V'tzom Chamishi, V'tzom Asiri, the fast days that are mentioned in the Nevi'im, those fast days are not from the Torah. They're from the later period. And just like we accept the fast days, why can't we add the holiday of Purim as well as the Megillah? And what do we have here in the last paragraph? Hiskimu aleha lahachzik b'hapurim ulasoto chok olam v'zot shenit v'nichtav b'sefer. They acquiesced, the rabbis acquiesced to her request. And the book of Esther, as well as the holiday of Purim, is added to the Jewish calendar, and the book is added to the Jewish canon, the biblical canon. So chapter 9, where we usually have lost a little bit of interest, or our attention span has sort of waned a little bit by the end of it, is a very, very important one in terms of understanding the history of the holiday of Purim. Right? So Esther and Mordechai, we see, have to advocate. They have to work hard to get the holiday and to get the book inside the Jewish canon. But this status of Megillat Esther is still questionable for generations to come from the time of Esther. Because we see here in the Gemara Megillah, what does the Gemara write? Rav Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel, a scroll of Esther does not render one's hands tameh, because it's not one of the holy scriptures. We know that according to Chazal, any of the books of the Tanakh make a person tameh, and therefore if they want to eat truma afterwards, or they want to do something in terms of the Beit HaMikdash, they would have to purify themselves. But we're told here that the book of Esther does not make someone's hands tameh. Are we to say that Shmuel holds that Esther was not comprised with Ruach HaKodesh, with the divine spirit? After all, Shmuel himself has said Esther was indeed composed with divine spirit. So what's the answer that the Gemara gives? Esther was composed with the divine spirit for the purpose of reading, but it was not composed with the purpose of being written down and included in the Holy Scriptures. So we see here the questionable status. This is the Gemara in Megillah. The Gemara we're talking about the year 400 CE. We're talking about hundreds of years after the holiday of Purim, and we still see there are questions regarding its status. Interesting to note that in Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were unearthed, no scroll of Esther was found. They found all the books of the Jewish canon, all the books except for Megillat Esther. And we'll talk about that later on. So there's something problematic about the book of Esther. There are questions that are raised regarding it. And what I want to do now is let's look at some of the questions that are connected to the book of Esther. And then let's compare our story to the story of Yosef which will, in a sense, highlight those differences. And let's see what we can learn from this comparison. So we're going to quickly now just look at some questionable sections of Megillat Esther. So we begin with the beginning of Megillat Esther, which we know about. It's the times of Achashverosh, and we know that Achashverosh likes to make parties. And if we look here in verse Hey, where it's bolded, ובמלאת הימים האלה עשה המלך לכל העם הנמצאים בשושן הבירה למגדול ועד קטן 7 ימים בחצר גינת ביתן המלך. After making a party of 180 days for the important people in his empire, he then makes a party for just the people living in Shushan HaBirah. And we know that in Shushan HaBirah there were not only non-Jews, but there were also Jewish people living in Shushan HaBirah. Actually, we know that Nehemiah, in the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, ends up moving to Eretz Yisrael, and he had been living in Shushan HaBirah. So we have Jews living there, and the question is, how involved were they in this party that's being described? And the opulence of the palace, we're told, Chor, Karpas, and so on. Look in Pesuk Zayin, Vashkot Bechlei Zahav, and they're drinking Kelim Shonim, Yayin Malchut Rab Kiyat HaMelech. And there's no end to the amount of liquor that's being brought to the table at this party. So chapter 1, we're introduced to the book of Esther. There's drinking, there's materialism, there's opulence, which certainly is not in the Avirah, it's not what we would think about when we think of a Jewish celebration. Then we move on to chapter 2. And in chapter 2, we're introduced to what? We're introduced to both Mordechai and we're introduced to Esther. And we're told in Pesuk Zayin, Vahi omen et Hadassah hi Esther batodo. He had adopted, in a sense, he had raised Esther. She had no parents. And she's beautiful. And when her parents died, he took her as a daughter. And when it becomes her turn to be taken to the king, and we know the story, so I don't have to review the story. And then we know that Mordechai ends up choosing her from among all the women. And so this whole episode here of Esther being brought to the palace and marrying this non-Jewish king raised all kinds of halakhic issues regarding a Jew marrying a non-Jew, but even more so. Soon we're going to be in a time of persecution. We're going to have when Haman wants to destroy all the Jewish people. And we know that a Jew during a time of persecution has to give up their life for not only the big 3 sins, idol worship, idolatry, and adultery, but also has to give up their life for other sins. And the Gemara raises the question, how is it possible that Esther could be married to a non-Jew during this time period and sleep with Achashverosh when everybody knows about it? Okay, so the Gemara here in Sanhedrin, where they talk about the idea of giving up your life, Kiddush Hashem, giving your life for the sanctity of God. All right, we know that in times of persecution, a person gives up their life for God in the name of God. So they ask the question, first of all, how many do we need in order for it to be considered a public act? And then they ask us, we can skip the Gemara here. The Gemara infers that we need 10 Jewish people, the idea of a minyan. Once we have 10 Jewish people, it's considered public. And at the very, very end, what do they ask? The Hai Esther Farhesia Have. Wait a minute, Esther marrying the king, living in the palace, and sleeping with the king, that's a public act. How could Esther have transgressed the idea of intermarrying and sleeping with the king in such a time period? And what does the Gemara answer? Amar Abaye, Esther Karka Olamaita. The famous answer of the Gemara is that Esther was like the ground, meaning Esther was passive. Esther was passive during the sexual act. And therefore, according to Gemara, because she was passive during the sexual act, because she was, in a sense, forced, she didn't choose to marry the king, she didn't choose to engage in sexual relations with him, so therefore she's not held responsible, and she didn't have to give up her life. But we see that Chazal are bothered by what's transpiring in the palace. Moreover, according to the Megillah, and I think, according to the Gemara, and I think many of us are familiar with it, and it's here in the red, it says that Mordechai took her as a daughter, a bat. But the Gemara here in Megillah talks about the fact that we read it not a bat, not a daughter, but as a bayit, as a home, meaning as a wife. According to Chazal, Mordechai actually married Esther. And if that's the case, we have a more pressing problem. We're not only talking about intermarriage with a non-Jew during a time of persecution, we're actually talking about adultery. Because how could she be married to Mordechai and sleeping with the king at the same time? So chapter 2 raises all kinds of questions in the eyes of the Gemara regarding the Megillah. What kind of personality is being presented to us here in chapter 2, and what kind of relations are being presented to us? And then we move on to the idea of their names. We know that Esther has two names, Hadassah and Esther. And the Gemara and Megillah raises all kinds of questions regarding the meaning of these names. And what is the second opinion here? Rabbi Nehemiah Omer on the second line, Hadassah Shema, her name was Hadassah. Vilama Nikreit Esther, why is she called Esther? Shahaya Umot Ha'olam Korinota Al Shem Istar, because she was called this by the nations of the world in the name of Istar. And what is Istar? According to Rashi, Istar is the Yareach, it's the moon. And according to others, Istar Eshtar is the name of a star, the morning star. So according to many, Esther's name is a name which is connected to astrology, astronomy, and also we know that in the ancient world, people worshipped the different constellations. So her name, Esther, is a foreign name which is connected to all kinds of behavior which is non-Jewish. And what about the name Mordechai? So many believe that the name Mordechai is connected to the name Marduk, and Marduk was the name of a Babylonian god. So we see that the two Jewish protagonists in our story, both carry names. With Mordechai, he only has one name. With Esther, she has two. Both carry names that are connected in a sense, that are connected to the larger world around them, and are even connected to the idea of Avodah Zarah. Right? So we're talking here about assimilation, we're talking about acculturation, and these are the two stars of our Megillah. And let's go on. Then in chapter 2, what do we read about? We read about that she's taken to the palace, and she doesn't tell anyone who she is. Because Mordechai has commanded, don't say who you are. And then later on, it's repeated in chapter 2, Pasuk Chaf, Ein Esther magedet moladeta ve'et ama kasher tziva aleha Mordechai. So we see here that Esther is concealing her Jewish identity, right? Which is also a questionable act. Why is she hiding who she is? And more than that, if we move on to the next chapter and we read about Haman's decrees. So Haman decrees to kill all the Jewish people. And Mordechai sends word, he wants to send word to Esther in the palace, what's happening? All right, so he sends a message to her here in the first paragraph. And how does Esther respond? Vatomer Esther lahatach, hatach is the messenger, vatitzaveu el Mordechai, to tell Mordechai. Everybody knows, kol avei hamelech ve'am medinot hamelech yodim. Asher kol ish ve'isha asher yavo el hamelech el hachatzer hapnimit asher lo yikare achat dato lahamit. Everybody knows that if I go to see the king and to try to advocate for the Jewish people, and I have not been invited, and he doesn't put out his golden scepter, then I'm going to die. Okay, this is Esther's concern when she has been told through a messenger that the Jewish people are slated to be murdered. This is her response. And how does Mordechai respond to her? The famous words, Vayomer Mordechai lahashiv el Esther. Al tedami benafshech v'ma'aleit beit hamelech mikol hayudim. Don't think that you can save yourself by living in the palace. Ki im hacharesh tacharishi ba'et hazot. Because if you are quiet, if you are silent, if you do not act at this moment, revach v'hatzala ya'amod leyudim imakom acher. Salvation for the Jewish people come from a different direction. Ve'at ubeit avich tovedu, and you will be destroyed. Who knows if for this specific reason you were chosen to be queen? All right, so Mordechai is trying to push her, okay, to act on the Jewish people. So we see here that from Esther's first reaction that she is slightly detached from her people, which is understandable. After all, she's living in this palace with a harem and all kinds of guards, and she's physically disconnected from her people. So another question mark regarding the Megillah. And of course, another pressing question regarding the Megillah is, it's the only book of the Tanakh that doesn't mention Hashem's name, not once. So if we put this all together, we can say that ostensibly, right, our story, Megillat Esther, is a secular one. Hedonistic, acculturation, intermarriage, adultery, concealment of Jewish identity, God's name is absent. these are a lot of question marks that we can raise regarding why should this story be part of the Jewish canon? Why should this be part of our Tanakh? And what is the solution? The solution is to Judaize the story, to find all kinds of elements that we can add and embellish in order to make our story more Jewish or more kosher. And it's fascinating to see how this transpires. So what does the Gemara tell us? We know the Megillah mentions the Et Sheva HaNa'arot, that she had 7 women to wait on her, Esther. So what does the Gemara write? Amarava, Shahita Mona Bahen Yemei Shabbat. That each day another woman worked, and this way she knew when it came for the time of Shabbat. Right? By one of the women was Mishabbat, and then she knew. So according, to the Gemara, we see that Esther is concerned about keeping Shabbat. Vayishane et na'arotem, we have the changing of the women. What is the Gemara? This is lakachtov, but it's based on the Gemara. Shekol ma shayu mevakshot hayu noten la. Okay, so whatever she asked for, Esther would be given. The Esther hayta ochelet ma'achal Yehudi im na'aroteha. Okay, she would only eat kosher food. Ve'en adam margish ba shehi Yehudit. She and her women would eat this kosher food, so no one would know. So we see that according to the Talmudic sources, she is keeping Shabbat. And Esther is what? She is also keeping kashrus. And then the Megillah, the Gemara goes on something even more astounding. On the verse and the bidding of Mordechai, Esther did. Rabbi Yirmiyah said, this teaches us that she used to show her menstrual blood to the sages to determine if she was a nidah. The verse concludes just as she was when she was raised with him. Rabbi Bar Lima said this indicates that she used to rise from the bosom of Ahasuerus and immerse herself and sit in the bosom of Mordechai. All right, so according to the Gemara, she's also keeping the laws of Nidah. Clearly, we see what's motivating Chazal, the Gemara, and so on to do what they're doing, because we saw all the problems that we raised earlier regarding our story. And what about prayer? We know that Esther fasts, but we never hear a prayer. So we have a famous prayer in Sefer Tehillim, Perek Chafet, Lamanatseach al Ayelet HaShachar, word to the conductor regarding Ayelet HaShachar. We'll see what that means in a moment. Mizmor LeDavid, a hymn of David. Notice the book of Psalms tells us who is the author of this psalm? David. Okay, yet we're going to see what Chazal does with this chapter 22. What do the words Ayelet HaShachar mean? So if we look in Rashi here to the left, Ayelet HaShachar, Rashi writes, the name of a musical instrument. Okay, his first answer is that Ayelet HaShachar, to the conductor on this musical instrument. Another explanation concerning the nation of Israel, which is a beloved hind, okay, which is a beloved hind who looks forth like the dawn. Okay, so according to the second explanation, the word ayelet is like ayal, ayelet, it's a hind that looks forth towards the morning. And then Rashi goes on to say, our sages, however, interpret it as referring to Esther. Right, so according to Chazal, this is based on the Gemara here. We'll just read the beginning of it. And she stood in the inner court of the king's house. This is when Esther is coming without being invited to the king's inner chamber. Rav Levi said, when she reached the chamber of the idols, the divine presence left her. Ruach HaKodesh left her. She said, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? These famous words in verse B, Eli, Eli, lama azavtani. So according to Chazal, Tehillim Perek Chafet is the prayer that she utters before she goes into the king's inner chamber, having not been invited. And another Gemara in Yoma, in Masechet Yoma says, Amar Rabbi Asi, Lama nimshala Esther l'shachar. Why is Esther compared here to the morning, to the dawn? Shachar like shacharit. Lomar lecha, to teach you. Masha shachar sof kol halayla. Just like the morning is the end of darkness, af Esther sof kol hanisim. So too Esther was the end of the period of miracles, like we saw in the beginning. We're at the end of the period of Nevuah, Ruach HaKodesh, and that's why the biblical canon is being put together. So it's interesting, notice that they connect Esther to this phrase, and we know the word shachar is morning, and that also connects us back to what we saw earlier, that maybe the name Esther is connected to the stars, right? The morning star, which would fit in very nicely with what we have here. But what have Chazal done? Chazal have basically put a prayer in Esther's mouth, which is missing from the book of Esther. Not only does the Gemara put a prayer in Esther's mouth, but so does the Midrash. And this is a Midrash from the book Otzar Midrashim. It's a compendium of small Midrashim. And listen, look at this beautiful prayer that is implanted into Esther's mouth. The Esther HaMalka Shava La'el B'chol Liba. And Esther, the queen, returned to God with all her heart. Notice she returned to God, which we can infer from this that what? She had been distanced from God. Yir'ah v'zochelet me'emat hamavet asher nafla aleha. A week filled with fear because of the terrible decree that was placed upon her. Vatishot bigdei hamalchut. She disrobes from her very royal clothing. Vatikach bigdei ha'evel. And she puts on mourning clothing. Ubekom habisamim, in place of the beautiful perfumes that she wore, hinicha ha'efer v'ha'afar, right? She puts ashes and dirt on her face. And what is her prayer according to the Midrash? Vatitpalel Hashem v'tamar, Ata Adonai Malki v'ani amatecha, I am your maidservant. Azreini v'hoshieni ki ein li ozer zulatecha, save me, there's no one who can save me besides you. V'ata chatanu lacha, we have sinned, we have vidui here. Okay, we have supplication, we have admitting our sins. V'avinu lefanecha ulecho masarta otanu v'lachein masarta otanu b'yad oivenu. All right, and then she goes on to say, if we skip down to the fourth line, Lo achalti b'sudat Haman, I did not eat from the banquet of Haman, improper food. Lo chafatzti ligael belechem chamudot hamelech, v'lo shatiti yayin nescham, and I didn't drink from this improper wine that had been touched by 9 Jews, etc., etc. So we see here this prayer that is implanted into Esther's mouth, according to the Midrash, detailing some of the things that a person reading the Megillah might think that she might have transgressed. These additions are also found in the Septuagint. In the Greek translation of the Tanakh, we have additions containing both prayers of Mordechai and Esther, and we'll read just a few of them. We have sinned against you and you have handed us over to our enemies. It's very similar to what we saw in the Midrash. You know that I abhor the bed of the uncircumcised and of any foreigner. You know that I abhor the symbol of my lofty position, which is in my head, and when I am in public, I abhor it like a menstruous rag. Your servant has never dined at Haman's table, nor have extolled the king's banquet or drank the wine of libations. So we see that all these different sources are adding a prayer to Esther's mouth. And of course, the most pressing problem that we saw regarding Megillat Esther is that God's name isn't mentioned. And what do we see regarding God's name? So the Gemara Megillah tells us on the famous verse when Achashverosh can't sleep, Balayla hahu nadedat shnat hamelech. What does the Gemara say? Amar Rabbi Tanchum Nadadash Natmal Kol She'olam. Here the word Melech doesn't mean Achashverosh, the king of flesh and blood, but it means God of gods, the king of kings. On that night, God himself couldn't sleep. So Chazal find a hint, okay, to God here in this verse. And if we go down to the famous verse that we saw earlier, when Mordechai shakes Esther and says, if you don't act, then salvation will come from another direction. Look what the Aramaic translations of the Megillah do. The first Targum says, Ruach v'hatzala yamod liyudim b'makom acher b'shel zchut avot v'yatzil otam ribon ha'olamim, and God will save them. Meaning that an Aramaic translation adds into the translation of our verse. If you don't save them, then God himself will save the Jewish people. So we see all of these efforts by the Gemara and by the Targumim to what? To fill in here that God's name does appear. So what have we seen? We've seen that we have a filling in of the void. The void is a fact that it seems like ostensibly a very, very secular book. And what do the different sources do? They Judicize it by filling in information that's not in the text. And it's done by the Talmud, it's done by the Targum, and it's done by the Midrash. Let's go back to what I mentioned earlier in the beginning. We had mentioned that all the books have been found in Qumran. And incidentally, guys, Qumran is a wonderful tiyul. It's on the way to Yam HaMelech. You can just go. I just went with my husband one time, and there there are tour guides there. You don't even need a tour guide. You can get the headphones and you can walk through Qumran. It's fascinating. I would very much recommend going to Qumran. In any event, why is there no Megillat Esther? Of all the books of the Canon, didn't find Megillat Esther, and it could be okay. Some have suggested theological reasons. Esther is not a particularly religious book. It lacks any interest in Judah and its cultic institutions, and it has a sympathetic view towards the Gentile king Achashverosh. Moreover, it is the only book of the Hebrew Bible that does not mention the name of Hashem. And others say that maybe it's just by chance they didn't find it. Okay, but it's very, very interesting that of all the books, Esther was not found. So now what I want to do is I want to leave Esther for a moment, and I want to compare the story of Esther to the Yosef story. and see the differences between our two stories. And what we're going to now uncover is a biblical analogy. A biblical analogy is when a later book of the Tanakh uses an earlier story and borrows from that earlier story themes and words. And by borrowing and by mirroring the later story in the framework of an earlier story, it's trying to teach us and tell us a message. So let's look at this analogy between our two stories. So again, I'm not going to go over the whole Joseph story. I think that most of us are familiar with it. And if there aren't some of the details you might not be aware of, but the general picture we all know. So we have two stories that transpire outside the land of Israel, right? Esther is in Persia and Yosef is in Egypt. Both of them experience a meteoric rise to fame. Esther becomes the queen of Persia and Joseph becomes the second in command of Egypt. Both of them intermarry within a royal or a noble household. We know that Esther marries Achashverosh the king, and Yosef marries Osnat bat Potifera Kohen On into a noble family, a family of priests. Additional thematic similarities. They're both detached from their people for a limited period of time. We saw that with Esther. She's in the palace. When Mordechai says, come do something, she's hesitant. She also didn't know what was happening, transpiring outside with Haman's decrees until Mordechai sent the message. And Yosef also, he becomes viceroy in Egypt, and he sends no word back to his father that he is alive. Hardship befalls the Jewish people in both stories. In Esther, we have Haman's decrees. In Yosef, we have those 7 years of famine. They both use their positions to help their family or their nation. We know, of course, that Esther will save the Jewish people, and Yosef save his family from famine. They render a service connected to a pair of royal officials, which is forgotten over time. And here the comparison is with Mordechai. And we're going to see that our comparison between the two stories is not just with Esther, it's with Esther and Mordechai. And also with Joseph, it's not just Joseph, it's primarily Joseph, but it's also his family members. So Mordechai saves the king from the coup planned by Bigtan and Teresh. And Yosef also, he interprets the dreams of the butler and the baker. And in both cases, it's forgotten the good act for a while, and then it's remembered later on. And this is a very interesting one. Night is going to play a pivotal role in both stories. In Esther, it's because the king can sleep. And in the book of Yosef, it's because he can sleep, Pharaoh. He sleeps and he has a dream, and he doesn't know the interpretation of his dream. And the true identity of both of them is revealed during a scene of food and drink. With Esther, we know it's at her second banquet with Haman and Achashverosh. And with Yosef, it's when he reveals himself to his brothers when he's dining with them. So we see a tremendous number of thematic similarities. But that would not be enough for us to say we have here a clear biblical analogy between two stories. There's one other piece of the puzzle that has to fit. And that is that we need linguistic similarities. We need language that is going to link our two stories. And here we're going to see something incredible. We're going to see similar language. With Yosef, what are we told? With Yosef, after things work out and he wants to prepare Egypt for the 7 years of famine, and he gathers all the grain. He gathers all the grain and puts it into storehouses. And in the book of Esther, okay, and we look at the book of Esther, look at the language that is used. We also have a gathering in the book of Esther. What do we have a gathering of? We have a gathering of the girls in order to bring them to the palace. And notice the same exact words. Vayafked pikidim, vayikbutsu et kol, vayitav hadavar be'enei. It was good in the eyes of the king. So what's the theme here? What in a sense is saying? It seems to be saying that the women in the book of Esther, in the eyes of the officials and the eyes of the king, were like Joseph gathering wheat. They were mere objects. Okay, but the language here is connecting our two stories. And then, of course, we have the test. In Sefer, the story of Yosef, we have the story of Eshet Potiphar. And every day she's trying to entice Yosef. And he did not give in. And so too, in the story of Esther and Mordechai, we have the test, will Mordechai bow down to Haman or not? And notice the exact language, Vayhi Yom Yom V'lo Shama. Right? So the author of Sefer Esther is purposely molding this verse to reminisce to what? To just like Joseph was steadfast, so too is Mordechai. And then again, the qualities of both Esther and Yosef, we're told that Yosef is Yifat Toar v'Yifat Mar'eh, and he found favor in the eyes of everyone. And so too regarding Esther, she's Yifat Toar v'Tovat Mar'eh, and she finds favor in the eyes of others. And then when we talk about the suffering in both stories, in Sefer Breshit, when they come back without Yosef, what does Jacob utter? He never gets over it. And later on, when they want to send Binyamin down to Egypt, he's very scared to part with Binyamin because, after all, he's already lost one son from his beloved Rachel. And notice the language here: the kasher shakalti. And notice in Megillat Esther, when Esther, before she goes to see the king, she says, "Vakasher avadati." Notice the structure of the phrases are exactly the same. And then earlier in the story of Joseph, Ki ech ele el avi, how can I go back to my father? Lest I see his pain. This is when I have to go back without Binyamin. And what does Esther utter? Same exact language and structure. And in terms of the rise to power, we know both of them giving the ring, being clothed in royal garments, right, putting them on a horse or on a chariot, and calling before them, with a royal name. And in terms, another interesting analogy is at the end of the Joseph story, we have them embalming Yosef, and here in the beginning of our story of Esther, we have them the women, being anointed in all kinds of oils and so on. And clear here again, they're being anointed in oils like Yosef, like the father of Yaakov, like Yaakov was being anointed, embalmed at the end of his life. So we see here tremendous parallels between the two, not only in theme, but also in language. The idea that our two stories link is not a modern idea. It was already discovered by the Midrash. And the Midrash, Breshit Rabbah, we won't read the whole thing, but notice it's something fascinating. What does the Breshit Rabbah say on the story of Yosef? And he would talk to her day by day. Reb Yudan b'shem Reb Binyamin bar Levi. Reb Yudan said in the name of Reb Binyamin, B'nei Rachel Nisan Shaveh Ugdulatan Shaveh. The daughters of Rachel, their tests are similar, and their greatness will be similar. And B'nei Rachel here, the idea is the descendants of Rachel. We're talking about Yosef, and we're talking about Mordechai. And right then the Gemara the Midrash then brings analogies in language between our two stories, some of them which we just saw a moment ago. So this is an ancient analogy and not a modern one between our two stories of Yosef. So what do we see? That the author of Megillat Esther, which is, according to the Gemara, it's the Anshe Knesset HaGdolah, it's the men of the royal of the Great Assembly that actually put the book into the Canon. It could be that it was written by Esther and Mordechai and they just edited the book. In any event, whoever that author was, they molded our story to echo the story of Yosef. And the question is why? What's the message? What can this analogy teach us? What can it edify regarding our understanding of the story of Esther? And in order to get to that point, I think we now have to look at the differences between the two stories. Until now, we've seen what's similar. And so one difference between the two is the fact that Yosef says very clearly, went to the butler and the baker, Ki gunov gunafti me'eretz ha'ivrim. Okay, I was kidnapped from the land of the Hebrews. Okay, he did not hide his identity like we saw with Esther. They know he's an Ivri. They know he's a Hebrew, and he states it, and he doesn't hide it. But perhaps the most essential difference is that repeatedly throughout the story of Yosef, when here in the first scene is when Eshet Potiphar is trying to entice him, and what does she say? What does he answer her? How can I do this evil thing, this evil deed, this bad deed? I will sin to God. And then later on, when he's going to be remembered, and he's going to be taken out of the pit or the jail, and he's going to hear the dreams of Paro, and he's going to interpret those dreams, what does he say to Paro? Pasuk Tedzayin, Vaya'an Yosef et Paro lemar bil adai Elohim ya'anet shalom Paro. It is God who is answering the dreams, not me. The power doesn't emanate from me. The power emanates from God. And then later on, at the very end of our story, when Joseph reveals himself to his brothers in one of the most remarkable scenes in the whole Bible, right, in the whole Tanakh, what does he say to his brothers? Pasuk Hey, V'ata, and now al te'atzvu, don't be sad. V'al yichar be'enechem ki machartem oti, and don't be angry, don't be pained that you sold me here. Ki lemechaya, for salvation, shlachani Elokim lifnechem. God sent me on a mission. God sent me before you. And if we skip to verse Zion, Vayishlacheni Elohim lifnechem. God sent me here. And then again, he mentions God. Okay, this is a mission, a divine mission that I was sent on, and that's how I ended up in Egypt. So we see and Rashi says regarding Yosef, Shem Shamayim Shagur Befiv. I always laugh. I think it's like Susie sells seashells by this. It's like a tongue twister. Shem Shamayim Shagur Befiv. The name of God is constantly on the lips of Yosef. And I think this is the essential difference between the two stories. God is not hidden. God is described. God is mentioned. And God is a primary figure in the story of Yosef, in contrast to the story of Esther, where God's name isn't mentioned even once. And if that's the case, so what's the significance of this analogy, and what's the significance of this difference? So Professor Jonathan Grossman writes, Ha'analogia, the analogy, הרחבה לסיפור יוסף, רומזת שיש להעתיק את המפורש בסיפור יוסף ונעלם במגילת אסתר. He says the purpose of this analogy is that we have to do copy and paste. Copy what is evident from the story of Yosef, copy it to the story of Esther where it is missing. Right? And that's me. And this concept, there's a concept in Parshanut HaMikra, in biblical exegesis, Divrei Torah aniyim b'makom echad, v'ashirim b'makom acher. The words of the Torah or the Tanakh are poor in one area and rich in another, and that you can transfer information, okay, from one place to another. So Jonathan Grossman is saying to us, because of the stark and the clear analogy, both thematic and verbal analogy between these two stories, we can copy and paste something which is missing from the Megillat Esther. We can copy it from the Sipur of Yosef. And the Das Mikra series has something similar and more specific. And he says the following. Efshar shemechaber ha-Megillah mevakesh lahavlit. The author of the Megillah is trying to emphasize shehamesupar b'Megillah eino mu'rachat pa'ami. What's happening in this Megillah is not a one-time occurrence. Ala yesh bo ofi al histori, but it's above time. It spans the historical history of the Jewish people. Hahistoria ha-Yehudit ki'ilu chozeret al atzma. Jewish history repeats itself. Kasher yad hashkacha mechuvenet ota tamid. And the hand of God is constantly there. So similar to Jonathan Grossman, he's saying the hand of God, which is very, very clear in the story of Yosef. We can copy that to the story of Esther and understand that so too the hand of God is present in the story of Esther. Where is it present? You have to read between the lines. You have to look in the margins. You have to look underneath the lines. But God is there orchestrating history. And that's how both Jonathan Grossman and Damikra explain this analogy. I want to go one step further, and I want to propose that I think that we can nuance the analogy a tiny bit more. And I believe that we have here two paradigms of preservation of Jewish identity in exile. We have the Joseph paradigm, where the Jew can be outright about being Jewish, and he can be Jewish in what he does, and he can be Jewish in what he says. That's the Joseph paradigm. And yet we have another paradigm, and that's the Esther paradigm, where no, a Jew has to hide their identity, has to work quietly and silently behind the scenes in order to orchestrate salvation for the Jewish people. And these paradigms, I think, obviously depend on place. And just perhaps a modern example, we know that the Trump administration, right, was very, very Jewish. The people who were around President Trump were Orthodox Jews. David Fredman, Orthodox Jew, and some of them wore kippot, many of them did not wear kippot, but their Jewishness was evident, okay? And that's the Joseph paradigm. But if we go across the ocean and go to France, okay, the same place, same period, right? In France, no. In France, at the same time, we couldn't have a Joseph paradigm. We'd have the Esther paradigm, where it's quiet. It would be behind the scenes. It would be without pointing attention or drawing attention to the fact that the person was Jewish. So it depends on place. It also depends on time. After the Trump administration, with the Biden administration, will those surrounding the president, can there be a Joseph paradigm now in the United States? Can it be as Joseph as it was before? I don't know. Okay, so time also plays a role in terms of, is it a Joseph paradigm or is it an Esther paradigm? And the last thing I want to mention is the idea of gender. and I think gender does play a role. Can a woman in a place of power be a Joseph kind of character? Can they be outrightly so Jewish and so what and or must they sort of or must they hide a little bit of what they are and be a little bit more cautious in how they act? Are women in positions of power perhaps more vulnerable than men are? I don't know. I raised it as a question. Perhaps behind these two paradigms is also the idea that we're talking about a man and we're talking about a woman. I'm not sure. I just want to end with the following, and it sort of links us back to the beginning of our shiur, and that is that we have to keep in mind also when the story of Esther took place, and I think that will also shed light on this Esther paradigm. The story takes place, I hope it doesn't look confusing, we're starting on this side, on the right side. We start with the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash by the Babylonians in 586 BCE. And then we know that in 521, we have Cyrus, the king of Persia. The Babylonian Empire is going to be conquered. We have one king of Media for 1 year, Dariavish, and then we have the Cyrus Declaration, 521, and the Jews can return back to Eretz Yisrael. This is the famous Hatzarat Koresh. They can come back and build the Beit HaMikdash. They return a small number. Then we have a delay of 18 years of building the Beit HaMikdash, and then during the time of Dariavish Hasheni, Dariavish the Parsi, we have the building the Beit HaMikdash. According to Chazal, our story of Purim occurs right here in the middle, during those 18 years of delay. Notice, the story of Esther occurs when they have a right and an ability to return to Eretz Yisrael, but they did not return. The Jews who are now endangered throughout the provinces of Achashverosh are Jews who made the decision not to return to Eretz Yisrael. And perhaps the Esther paradigm that we saw, which is in a sense more painful, definitely more painful than the Joseph paradigm, is partially as a result of the fact that the Jews during the time of Esther had decided that we are not returning to Eretz Yisrael for whatever reasons they had for not returning. And perhaps this paradigm of life in Galut, the Esther paradigm, which we have seen repeatedly throughout Jewish history, perhaps it could have been a little bit different. It would have been a little bit different, a lot different, if the Jews in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah had all decided to return to Eretz Yisrael. So I think the Esther paradigm, which is more painful than the Joseph one, is partially an outgrowth of the time period in which the story happened, when Jews specifically made a decision not to return to Eretz Yisrael. I just want to stop this share for a moment. And how lucky that we are, all of us, who have made that decision to return to Eretz Yisrael, to be here and entrust our future with the future of the Jewish people in our homeland. And I think that's a very, very, one of the important messages of the story of Esther, that it didn't have to happen if the Jews would have returned to Eretz Yisrael. But they made that decision not to return to Eretz Yisrael, and the story played itself out as it did. So these are just some ideas about the story of Esther. When you're in Unearthed Hashem, when you're listening to the Megillah next week, perhaps think about some of the things that we've talked about, the comparison between the two stories, and how that comparison can shed light upon our understanding of Megillat Esther, and the differences between that and the story of Yosef. So I'm happy to open it up for questions. Anything. Happy Purim to everybody.
Thank you so much, Lisa.
Thank you so much, Lisa. That was beautiful. Lisa, I had one question.
Comment? Nope. Comments, questions?
Thank you.
Yeah, you can ask. You had a question. You can ask your question. Maury?
I just wanted to know, you mentioned Esther's tefillah, and I was wondering.
Yeah, Maury, 1 second. Wait, Maury, 1 second. Lisa doesn't hear you. Wait a second. 1 second, Maury. Okay, try it again.
Okay, you mentioned Esther's tefillah.
I can't, Elisa, I don't hear anybody.
Oh, you don't hear? You, 1 second.
That it was found.
So we saw that in the Otzar Midrashim, a compendium Midrashim called Otzar Midrashim. We have the tefillah that we mentioned. Also in the Tehillim Perek Chavbet, Ayelet HaShachar, according to the Gemara, that is the prayer that she said before she entered into the inner room, the inner sanction of Achashverosh. Okay, also in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Tanakh, they also add a prayer.
Okay. Thank you so much. I want to invite you all to join us tomorrow. We have a new course starting with Bracha Kron on Tehillim in our Tefillah, the Prakim of Tehillim that show up throughout our davening. You're welcome to join for a free trial class or to sign up for the course if you like. It's 10:15 to 11:15 on Tuesdays. You can be in touch with me to get the Zoom link, and we'd love to see you there. Thank you again, Lisa, for a terrific shiur.
Great. Bye, everyone.
Thank you to Shelley, always.
Thank you, Shelley, and everybody. Purim Sameach to everyone. Wishes you Besorot Tovot.